Mesechta Beya, Perek Hey, Mishnah Aleph. Meshilin Pereis Derech Haruba B'Yamtiv Avalei B'Shabbos. Midrabanon, it's also to expend efforts on Shabbos and Yom Tov for something that will not be needed until a later day. It's a tircha shalei l'tzorech, because it detracts from the restful quality of the day. In some cases, the Chachamim were matir, making some degree of effort in order to prevent a financial loss. So Mashilin Pereis Derech Haruba B'Yamtiv Avalei B'Shabbos. We may throw produce that's on a roof, having been left it to dry through a skylight on Yom Tov, in order to protect it from rain that's about to fall. Although this requires some effort, it's mutter in order to prevent the produce from being damaged by the rain. Throwing even a large amount of produce through the skylight takes very little effort because the produce needs only to be moved to the skylight and then dropped. However, it's also to throw the produce through a window in a wall, which is next to the roof, because one would then have to lift the produce to the window, which requires much more effort. Avalei b'Shabbos. However, we may not throw produce through a skylight on Shabbos because the Isser against activities requiring tircha is stricter on Shabbos. The Mishnah's case is where the person intended only to protect the produce so it can be eaten another day. If he intended to eat it that day, so throwing through the skylight would be permitted even on Shabbos. We may cover produce with cloths to prevent the rainwater from dripping from a roof. And you may also cover pitchers of wine and pitchers of oil to protect them from dripping rainwater. And you may put a vessel under dripping water to catch the water so it will not damage the house on Shabbos. These activities are allowed even on Shabbos to prevent financial loss because they require almost no effort. Mishnah Beis. Kol shechayav lov mishum shvus, mishum rishus, mishum mitzvah, Shabbos. The Mishnah lists three different categories of malachas that are also midrabanan on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Any activity that one is obligated to refrain from doing so on Shabbos, whether it is mishum shvus, an ordinary activity that's subject to a issur d'Rabbanan, or mishum rishus, an optional mitzvah that is subject to a rabbinical prohibition. In this context, an optional mitzvah is one that's optional in some situations but mechuyev in others. However, even where it is mechuyev, the Chachamim are doing it on Shabbos and Yom Tov, and will give examples in the Hemshech HaMishnah. And then you have Mishum Mitzvah, an unconditional mitzvah that's subject to an issur d'Rabbanan. This is a mitzvah that applies equally in all situations, but is also on Shabbos and Yom Tov, which will also be explained in the Mishnah. So all these three categories, that if a person is chayav on it, Mishum Shvus, Mishum Rishus, Mishum Mitzvah b'Shabbos, since one is obligated to refrain from doing it on Shabbos, chayav lov b'Yom Tov, one is obligated to refrain from doing it on Yom Tov as well. Be'elohein mishum shvus. These are ordinary activities that are subject to a issur d'Rabbanan called a shvus. Lo oilin be'ilan. You may not climb a tree because one might break off a branch or fruit. V'lo reichven al gabe behema. You may not ride an animal because one might break off a branch to use it as a whip. V'lo shatan al panei hamayim. And you may not swim on the water because one might build a raft. V'lo metabchen, or break off a branch to use it as a floating device or a raft. V'lo metabchen, v'lo mesabchen, v'lo meraktin. And you may not clap hands, slap thighs, or dance, because these actions are often accompanied by music, so that they might lead to repairing a musical instrument. In many communities today, people do not refrain from clapping and dancing on Shabbos and Yom Tov, which is brought down in Shulchan Aruch, a justification for this practice. These malachas are certainly permitted and encouraged on Simchas Torah to fulfill the mitzvah of giving honor to the Torah. Ve'elohein mishum rishus. And these are optional mitzvahs that are subject to issur d'Rabbanan. Leidonin, v'le mekadshin, lechelzin, v'le miyabin. It may not be done as a dayan in a din Torah, a court case, or to do kedushin. Marriage takes place in two stages. The act of kedushin, which usually consists of a man giving a woman an object of value, such as a ring, which makes the woman usher to all other men. And the second step, which is nesuin, which usually consists of the chuppah ceremony, permits them to live together as husband and wife, which you have the whole Masechta Kedushin and other portions of Seder Nashim that deal with the concept of Kedushin. If a married man dies without children, his brother is required to marry the widow. This marriage is called Yibum. If the brother or the widow refuses to marry, they perform the ceremony of Chalitza. The widow removes the brother's shoe, spits on the ground before him, and makes a declaration that she doesn't want to marry him. She's then free to marry anybody else. As mentioned earlier, the Mishnah refers to these mitzvahs as optional, because in some situations they're voluntary rather than obligatory. Serving as a judge is obligatory only when a superior judge is not available. A man must marry only if he doesn't already have a wife and children, and the brother of a childless husband must be even more chalitza only if there's no other brother to do so. And also, it doesn't necessarily have to happen right now. But because there are other brothers, then it becomes a rishos because it's a mitzvah begadol liyabim. And what's the reason why all these malachas are asur? These activities, even though they're mitzvahs, are asur on Shabbos Yantiv because they might lead to writing a record or a marriage document. Even for Yibam Chalitza, they would have the Rabbanah, they would have a rabbinical document that they might sign. Ve'elohein mishum mitzvah. These are unconditional mitzvahs that have an Issa Rabbanah attached to it on Shabbos or Yantiv. Le'makdishin, v'le'marichin, v'le'machrimin. You may not make something hektish, sacred to the Beis HaMikdash. Making something hektish includes designating an animal as a carbon and donating an item to the Bedek HaBayis. V'le'marichin. You may not make a erech vow, which is a vow to pay a person's value to the Beis HaMikdash. The Torah, Parshas Bechukaisai, lists erechin, which means values, and the singular of erechin is erech, for people depending on age and gender. For example, a male between the ages of 20 and 60 has an erech of 50 silver shekalim. One says that he'll give the erech of a certain person, he must give that specified amount to the Beis HaMikdash. Malay machrimin, and you may not make something cherem. What's a cherem? It's something that's dedicated to the Beis HaMikdash or to the Kohanim. If a person says that an object is a cherem, it means it's set apart, it becomes a property of the Beis HaMikdash. If he says that it's a cherem to the Kohanim, it becomes a property of the Kohanim. Since these malachas involve transferring the ownership, the bailos of money or an object, to the Beis HaMikdash or to the Kohanim, it resembles a business transaction, which is asur on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Doing business is asur on Shabbos and Yom Tov because it might lead to the malacha of writing. Like being truma or meiser, and also you don't separate truma or meiser from food because doing so makes the food fit to be eaten and resembles tikkun mona, repairing a utensil, making it fit to be used. Although these acts are mitzvahs, they may not be performed on Shabbos or Yom Tov. Kol elu b'Yom Tov amru, kal v'chaymer b'Shabbos. The Chacham stated that all these prohibitions are in connection with Yom Tov. So it certainly applies on Shabbos, which the halachas are a lot stricter. Here the Mishnah refers to the Yisurim that Rabbanon made with respect to Yom Tov, which would definitely apply on Shabbos as well. The Mishnah's opening statement, any malacha, kol shechayavin lav mishum shvus, one must refrain from doing it on Yom Tov, refers to the opposite situation, which are Yisurim that the Rabbanon made in connection with Shabbos, which extend over to Yom Tov as well. Ein ben Yom Tov l'Shabbos halo eichel nefesh b'lfad. This Mishnah appears elsewhere in Mesechta Megillah. There's no difference between Yom Tov and Shabbos except in regard to food preparation, for which the malach is allowed on Yom Tov but not on Shabbos. The Torah is matir doing certain malachas on Yom Tov in order to prepare food they'll be eaten that day. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue as to whether these food preparation malachas may be done for other purposes as well. By specifying eichel nefesh, our Mishnah implies that it follows Beis Shammai in this matter. Our Mishnah indicates that with the exception of food preparation, any activity permitted on Yom Tov is permitted on Shabbos as well. It thus disagrees with the previous Mishnah, which allowed throwing produce through a skylight, even if one doesn't intend to eat it that day, only on Yom Tov and not on Shabbos. Mishnah Gimel. Habahema va'akelim kiragle habaylim. This takes us back to Masechta Erevin in the discussion of Erev Tchumen. So it was mentioned in the previous parak, the concept of Erev Tchumen, but let's go revisit the Inyan. The next 5 Mishnayos discuss halachas of Tchumen. A person is asur on Shabbos Yom Tov to go more than 2,000 amos from his place of residence, and this limit is called Tchum Shabbos, or Tchum. A person's residence is defined as the place where he was when Shabbos Yom Tov began. If he was in a town, the Tchum is measured from the town's limits, as explained in Erevin Parak Hey. If he was in an isolated building, the Tchum is measured from its outer walls. And if he was out in the open, his residence extends 4 amos, and the Tchum is measured from that area. A person can change his residence and Tchum before Shabbos Yom Tov by means of an Erev Tchumen. He does this by putting food in a place that's up to 2,000 amos away from his actual residence. With respect to the halachos of Tchumen, his residence is shifted to the place where the food is, and the Tchum starts from 2,000. The Tchum of 2,000 amos starts from there. So Abehema v'akelim kiragle habaylim. Animals and utensils have the Tchum of their owner. It literally means that they have the feet like their owner. A person's property is also subject to the halachas of Tchumen. Just as a person may not go more than 2,000 amos from his place of residence, so too his kelim, or his behemoths, may not be taken by him or anyone else more than 2,000 amos away from his place of residence. If one hands over his animals to a son or to a shepherd on Yom Tov to bring into the field, these animals still have the same tchum as their owner, and not the tchum of the person who is entrusted with the animals. The tchum of a person, or kalim, or a behema, is determined when Yom Tov begins. Since these animals will still belong to the owner at that time, they remain subject to the tchum even after they are handed over to someone else on Yom Tov. Animals are usually given to a shepherd's care for the daytime and returned to the owner at night. Had the animals been given to the shepherd before Yom Tov, they would have assumed the tchum of the shepherd. But since they were not given until the next morning, they retained the tchum of the owner. The Mishnah refers to a case where two shepherds were available, the owner's son and another person. It was not known at the beginning of Yom Tov who the owner would choose. Only then do the animals retain the tchum of the owner. However, if only one shepherd is available and all the local owners hire him, the animals assume his tchum even if they're not given to him until after Yom Tov starts. The Mishnah discusses the tchum in the case of objects owned by more than one person. The specific situation is where brothers inherited possessions that are in a house and they have not yet divided them amongst themselves. So they all own a share of them. However, not all the brothers have the same tchumen. For example, one of them made an erev tchumen. So if utensils that are jointly owned by several brothers are designated for the use of only one of the brothers in the house, the utensils have his tchum, even though the other brothers also own them. However, utensils that are not designated for any one brother, but are used by them all, may be moved only to a place where older brothers may go. They're all subject to the tchum restrictions of older brothers together.